Over the past decade, the Chinese Communist Party has been steadily expanding its presence in the Middle East through the Belt and Road Initiative. China has been buying oil, building ports, financing infrastructure, promoting the use of the Chinese yuan in energy settlements, and even positioned itself as a kind of mediator between regional powers like Saudi Arabia and Iran. In recent years, a very popular narrative has emerged across international policy circles. You hear it from pro-China analysts in Europe, from some voices within the American foreign policy establishment, from commentators online, and even from parts of academia and the mainstream media. The argument is always the same. The United States is withdrawing from the Middle East, and China is stepping into the According to this narrative, America is declining, the global balance of power is shifting, and Beijing is about to become the new dominant power in the region. But today, we're beginning to understand that much of this narrative was also a part of carefully constructed strategic message from Beijing, designed to create the impression that the global balance of power is shifting, that the East is rising while the West is declining. And the messaging reveals something deeper about the Chinese Communist Party itself. The United States is not only a powerful country, it is also a democratic one. For one authoritarian regime like the CCP, a combination of power and political legitimacy represents a fundamental threat. Then came a moment that shook the entire region. In August 2021, the Biden administration carried out a rapid withdrawal from Afghanistan. The chaotic scenes that followed sent shockwaves across the Middle East. For many of America's Gulf partners, the question suddenly became unavoidable. Is the United States still willing or even able to maintain the regional security order? Strategic confidence in American leadership took a serious hit, and Beijing moved quickly to take advantage at that moment. China began presenting itself as a responsible diplomatic coordinator in the Middle East, while also exploring the possibility of Chinese yuan-dominated energy trade with several Gulf oil exporters. At the same time, it seemed as if China might be stepping into a strategic vacuum. But as we're starting to see now, that story is beginning to fall apart. Recently, the grand story China has been telling about its rise in the Middle East has begun to collapse. After taking office, Donald Trump moved quickly to send a clear signal to the Gulf region. The US is back. In May 2025, Trump led a large delegation of American technology and business leaders on a visit to the Gulf, including Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates. During the trip, multiple agreements were reached on cooperation in artificial intelligence, semiconductor technologies, and large-scale data center development. On the surface, many media outlets reported this simply as a business story, high-tech cooperation between the US and Saudi Arabia. But if we look at it from a geopolitical perspective, this was actually the first step in America's return to the Middle East. The message to the Gulf states was very clear. Real power in the modern world doesn't come from slogans about a multipolar order. Real power comes from the ability to provide advanced technology, computing power, and credible security guarantees. The United States is now bringing AI, semiconductor technology, data centers, and the global computing infrastructure supply chain directly into the Gulf region. In doing so, Washington is effectively pulling those states back into its strategic orbit. And this development is particularly painful for Beijing, because China's influence in the Middle East was never built on the idea that China could actually protect anyone. Instead, it was built on what we might call a low-cost illusion. China can buy your oil, invest in your ports, finance infrastructure, and discuss local currency settlements. And unlike the United States, Beijing does not lecture partners about human rights, political systems, or military cooperation conditions. Many Middle Eastern countries are happy to do business with China, but that doesn't mean they believe China can replace the United States. It simply means that under protection of the American security umbrella, they are willing to add another buyer for their oil and another source of investment capital. There is also a deeper layer involved in values and trust. Compared with the ideological atheism of the Chinese Communist Party, many in the region still see the United States, even as a Christian country, as more predictable and more trustworthy than an atheist revolutionary regime. The United States keeps its commitments, it provides real capabilities, and cooperation with China is often viewed as a secondary option. Once the US returns to the center of the regional security architecture, China's model, wanting the economic benefits without paying the security costs, begins to fall apart very quickly. And the first crack in that system appears in Syria. The fall of the Assad regime after 55 years in power represents more than just a domestic political change in Syria. It also symbolizes the weakening of the entire Iranian regional axis. For decades, the Iran-Syria-Hezbollah network formed a major strategic backbone of the anti-American and anti-Israel camp in the Middle East. China was never the direct leader of this axis, but it benefited from the structure. As long as Iran continued its regional confrontation with the United States, and as long as Assad remained in power in Syria, Beijing could maintain a convenient diplomatic posture. China would present itself as a neutral peace mediator, continue purchasing discounted Iranian oil, and quietly benefit from a geopolitical environment that kept the United States strategically distracted in the region. In other words, Beijing was quietly free-riding on a geopolitical structure that others were maintaining. The fall of the Assad family regime therefore represents the first step in removing one of China's indirect geopolitical enablers in the Middle East. It means that one of the regional nodes capable of constraining the United States and Israel has been eliminated. But the real centerpiece of the story is Iran. The Iranian theocratic regime is one of the central pillars of the anti-American order in the Middle East. For decades, discussions about Iran in the region were usually focused on questions like, will Iran retaliate or will Iran escalate tensions? But the deeper issue is something else entirely. China has been quietly benefiting from the anti-American geopolitical structure that Iran helped maintain. And what Beijing depends on is not simply which leader is in power in Tehran, but the existence of a regime capable of permanently supplying discounted gray market energy. From Washington's perspective, the Iranian theocracy doesn't even have to collapse immediately for Beijing to feel pressure. As soon as the regime's stability, credibility, port logistics, or ability to tolerate maritime risk begins to decline, China's position starts to suffer. Because what the Chinese Communist Party truly cares about is not diplomatic prestige. What it cares about is oil. Ironically, oil is also the argument Chinese propaganda frequently uses to criticize the United States in the Middle East. They often claim that America doesn't care about Iranian people and it only cares about oil. But in reality, the country that cares most about oil is China, because China produces almost none of its own. For years, China has been purchasing large volumes of discounted Iranian crude through a complex gray market system. This system includes shadow fleets, reflag vessels, ships that turn off their AS tracking systems, then third country transshipments, intermediary networks in Hong Kong and the United Arab Emirates, and independent refineries in Shandong province that specialize in processing this kind of crude that is under sanction. Various settlement mechanisms have also been used in an attempt to reduce reliance on the US dollar. In fact, this arrangement allowed both the Chinese Communist Party and the Iranian theocratic regime to extract and profit from what should have been the shared national wealth of the Iranian people. And this joint system of extraction actually reached its peak during the Biden administration. Between 2021 and 2024, the Biden administration focused on Iran's policy heavily on reviving the JCPOA nuclear agreement, which in practice offered very limited leverage over Tehran. At the same time, Chinese teapot refineries were largely allowed to continue purchasing Iranian crude. As a result, Iran's oil production recovered to more than 1.5 million barrels per day. This enormous volume of trade created massive economic incentives for both sides. And it also led to the expansion of the so-called shadow fleet. They utilized tactics like falsifying origin documentation, conducting transactions in Chinese yuan, and bypassing dollar-based financial oversight. China and Iran were able to protect each other from sanctions and significantly expand their geopolitical influence through energy trade. But after Republicans returned into power, the strategic framing of Iranian oil changed. Instead of treating Iranian oil exports as a bargaining chip in negotiations, Washington began treating them as a source of funding for terrorism. This shift led to a campaign of targeted sanctions against Chinese teapot refineries that were purchasing Iranian crude. The focus of these sanctions was to cut off the cross-border Chinese yuan settlement channels linking these refineries with Chinese regional banks. Through a combination of secondary sanctions and direct penalties on refinery entities, the United States aimed to completely close the loopholes that allowed Iranian oil to bypass the dollar system. The result was that companies dependent on these illicit crude supplies suddenly found themselves unable to participate in global trade, effectively paralyzing their operations. Once we understand this geopolitical context, it becomes very clear why Beijing is looking increasingly uncomfortable. On the one hand, the Chinese Communist Party constantly talks about the de-dollarization and multipolar world, and the Chinese yuan-based settlements as if American financial power were already collapsing. But on the other hand, the moment tensions rise in the Strait of Hormuz, China immediately rushes to negotiate with Iran to ensure that Chinese oil shipments and Qatari LNG can continue passing safely through the strait. It tells us that despite all the propaganda about China being a rising military superpower, when its energy lifeline is threatened by Middle Eastern sea lanes, Beijing cannot independently protect its own shadow oil fleet passing through the Strait of Hormuz, nor can it help the Iranian theocratic regime maintain its regional influence. Instead, it can only watch as the entire geopolitical structure is gradually dismantled by the United States. And this reveals the true nature of the Chinese Communist Party strategy. Beijing wants influence, but it doesn't want to pay the costs of maintaining security order for the authoritarian regimes it cooperates with. It wants cheap Iranian oil, but it doesn't want to assume responsibility for the survival of Iran's theocratic regime. It wants to challenge the dollar through the Chinese yuan settlements and gray shipping networks, yet it remains completely dependent on the maritime stability maintained by American naval power. In other words, the entire narrative about China's rising power has always existed within the framework of the American-led global order. Recent military developments have also exposed another major problem for Beijing. The confrontation between the United States and Iran has not only undermined China's geopolitical position, it has also shattered the myth of China's domestic military technology. For years, China's propaganda has claimed that its military equipment is capable of matching the United States. But under the extreme operational pressures of real conflict, Chinese-made radar and air defense systems have shown severe weaknesses when facing American precision strikes. The core chips and sensor technologies appear to lag behind by entire technological generations. This has serious implications for China's arms export ambitions. Over the past several years, Beijing has aggressively marketed Chinese weapons to Middle Eastern countries. Systems such as the CH-series drones and the HQ air defense missile family, promoting them as affordable alternatives to American equipment. But this conflict revealed a critical weakness. In complex electromagnetic environments, the survivability of many Chinese systems appears extremely low. The image of technological strength that Beijing promotes exists mostly in propaganda videos and military parades. In reality, the United States has demonstrated through actual operations the technological gap that still separates the two systems. And beyond weapons technology, China still lacks something even more important. It cannot build the kind of integrated alliance architecture that the United States can. One that combines military protection, intelligence cooperation, technological supply chains, and financial networks into a sustainable geopolitical system. So, next time someone confidently claims that China is replacing the United States in the Middle East, the only reasonable response might be, "Sir, your pants just fell down." Thank you for watching. If you liked the video, please press like, subscribe, and share. This is Stan. I see you in the next one. Bye-bye.